about it ever since you talked to me. And I have to start. I can't just tell you the story of my life. I have to go back to my parents.
I know,
And,
I know.
and
I'll do the
That's-
interviewing and you'll do the answering.
Okay.
But I do want to see
Hear
more
her?
than your eyes. So can you pull the screen down just a tiny bit?
I'm gonna have to put on my hearing aids because I don't hear her,
Okay, yeah.
clear her.
You're gonna have to shout. Let's see.
Ah, I need mechanics in order to hear you.
That's fine. You're not 48, so I want
Okay.
you to hear me perfect.
All right. You ready? Here it comes.
Here it comes. So
All right.
I'll wait. Wait. Here's the thing. I know you like talking, and you're gonna do plenty of talking. But I'd like to ask the questions so that I can get the answers to specific. So we have like a timeline.
It's okay with me.
I don't know the timeline as well as you do. Okay, so let's start with your grandparents. So that
Okay, that's where I was going to start. To an unusual degree, my parents are a product of theirs and so forth. On my father's side, he was he
grandpa, can you
grandpa.
put the screen down again?
He was born in this country, but he was impregnated on the ship coming from Russia.
That's your father.
My father. Yeah.
Wait, grandpa, can you pull the screen back down?
My father.
Grandpa,
So he was born in this country. He's the,
pause. Can you pull your screen back down to the
Yeah.
angle I had it at?
Okay. Ashira, do you want his grandfather or his father?
honey, let us
Whatever
work
he
it out.
wants to tell me.
Okay.
Let us work it out. I'd like to start from what I think is psychologically the beginning,
Okay.
which is my father's birth in this country when he was born 6 months after the family arrived in the United States. He was impregnated. His mother was impregnated on the ship coming from Russia.
Okay.
So he was the only one of the whole family who was born in the United States. So when they went through immigration, he was 6 months old. So that's the start. He came from
His parents from?
Russia.
Which city? Do you know?
I have a book on it, actually. It was wiped out by the Germans in 1939, I believe, or 38. The whole town was destroyed and everyone killed. My father's father came here in 1908, approximately. My father was born in 1909. He was a con artist guy. He was not a highbrowed person, but on the other hand, he was married to the rabbi's daughter, which was, we never could figure that one out because she was an intellectual, she was cultured, she was high-minded, and she married what my father would call a mujak, someone of the land, a crude, dishonest, conniving person who, when he came to America, he made his living with a pushcart selling clothes, men's clothes, by the way. So he would stop men on the street and say, "You want a jacket, a pair of pants," and he would sell it to them. This is in Brooklyn.
Your father didn't think so highly of his father, it sounds like.
Not at all. He was a brute. The word that comes to my mind is something more vulgar. You want it raw? He was a prick. All of the other children, my father was born in this country. He was the only one. there were 4 kids in front of him. They were all older, and they figured things out. They wound up going to high school.
Can you give me their names?
Well, there was Oscar, um, was the poet. There was,
Oscar Williams.
boy, I'm getting, I think, stage fright that I can't come up with the names. Normally I can. Danny was the closest one to him. There was Harriet, who became paranoid. A very tragic story. And there was one other sister, which I can't come up with at the moment.
Harry was a dishwasher, correct?
No, Danny was the dishwasher. Danny was the dishwasher in the Merchant Marine Academy in Great Neck, by the way. And even though he had a stunted IQ, which I think was from the trauma for when the mother died, and she died violently, he nevertheless wrote a 500-page biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which is rather extraordinary. He spent the bulk of his life writing the biography of Roosevelt as a dishwasher in the Merchant Marine Academy in Great Neck. It's a rather unusual story.
So the oldest was Oscar Williams, correct?
I'll say it again.
The oldest was Oscar Williams.
The eldest was Oscar, that's correct. And Oscar became quite famous as an anthologist. He married, and they had a son by the name of Strephon, who they wanted. He was the same age as I am. He's dead now, by the way. I have a faint memory of it. When he was about 3-4 years old, Oscar brought them to my parents' house and said, I am an artist and I can't raise a child. I want you to adopt him. And my father said yes. My mother said no. And the answer was no. And we never heard of Strephon. When Oscar died, my father did the arrangement. Oscar was a horrible person. But nevertheless, my father financed him over a period of time. He was famous, but he was a horrible person. And my father and I went to the funeral home where he was laid out in a casket, and a young man comes in, and he says immediately to my father and to me, "Who are you?" And my father said, "I am Oscar's brother, and this is his nephew, Don." And Strephon said, "That's not true. My father had no relatives in the United States." And my father said to Strephon, "Strephon, I think you're in for a few surprises. Number one, your father was an immigrant from Russia. He claimed he had been by the time he died, he was 3rd-generation Episcopalian." So he said to Strephon, number one, you're Jewish. Your father was an immigrant from Russia, and you have a big family.
How did Strephon react?
He didn't believe it. And it took him a while. And then he eventually changed his name to Strephon Williams Kaplan.
Wow.
And wrote a number of books, by the way, on psychology. I met him a number of times. He tried borrowing money from my father, and then he tried borrowing money from me. We both turned him down. So that's a story. In terms of my father, let me talk about my father first and then my mother, because they're both extraordinary stories, unusual stories. My father was conceived on the boat, so he was like 6 months old when he arrived in America. All the older kids, they were all older than him, figured out things very quickly. They learned English because they only spoke, basically they spoke Yiddish. They all spoke Yiddish. and they all went off. The three older ones went to college, and they all they all became educated.
In the New York area?
Pardon?
They all went to college in the New York area?
Yes, they all went to City College, which was free.
Okay.
And that's where all the Jews went, was the City College in those
Grandpa,
days.
pull your screen back down. You just moved it, and I can
Yes.
see.
How's this?
Much
I
better.
see. Okay. When my father was 6, his mother was very unstable. She was, on the other hand, educated and cultivated and sensitive. Her husband, as I said before, was a mujak, a brutal man who really worshiped money more than anything else. And he was not that smart, I don't think. I think he was, he knew how to make a living. He knew how to make it in this world. He knew that the world was evil and power oriented, and you had to beat them at their own game by surviving. So
Streets.
the husband and wife were extraordinarily different. The mother was a son of a rabbi, and the mother was a daughter of a rabbi, and they lived in Russia with a dirt floor. They would bring the chickens in at night because they were afraid they would be stolen. That's how they lived in Russia, in the shtetl. And when they came to this country, they left them as quickly as possible. And they went out and got educations. They went to high school. They went to college. My father was the youngest, of course. And therefore, he was very much under the influence of his father. His mother died when he was 6, 7 years old. He had only one memory of her, where a truck would come along and sell ices, and his mother gave him a penny, and he went out and bought an ice for himself. And he came and he sat on his mother's lap and ate the ice. And it's the only memory he has of his mother.
Wow. How did she die?
She had had a mental breakdown, and her husband didn't call, they didn't have phones, but said that she was crazy, and a horse-drawn ambulance came for her, and she fought physically, and she hit her head as she was being dragged to this horse-drawn thing, all of which my father saw, and died shortly thereafter. That's how she died. She died violently, being dragged out of her home to go to a mental institute. That's how
Did
she
your
died.
father, Abe, see that happen?
He watched it. He was 6, 7 years old.
So he had two memories of her then.
That's correct. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Mm.
Needless to say, that's a pretty traumatic memory of one memory of his mother. From then on in, he was under the influence of his father. And when the time he graduated public school at 12, 13, and the father said we were too poor for him to go to high school. All the other siblings had gone to school in Russia, and that's Russia, Austria, right on the border. I have a book on the town, by the way, that you can have on the history of the town. It was wiped out by the Nazis. Grandpa said, you have to go to work. So at the age of 13, he went out to work. And for a year and a half, he worked for a Polish man who was delivering ice boxes. In those days, you had a big block of ice that was put in, and he was delivering it, but he needed someone to hold the horse while he made the deliveries. And my father made, I think, $1 a day, which Grandpa took. If Grandpa had let Abe go to high school, Abe would have been able to figure out going to City College. And in his mind, he would have become the lawyer that he always dreamed of being. But the $1 a week or $1 a day, whatever he earned, Grandpa said was they couldn't afford it. He was a son of a bitch, by the way. At a later date, when I was present, they always talked in Yiddish. The first language of both my mother and my father were the Yiddish. They both learned English only when they left home and started going to school. He felt that if he had been allowed to go to high school, he would have been able to figure out City College. He was the only one who didn't go to City College. He would have been a lawyer. Instead, he was a delivery man for 3-4 years. And then he sold vacuum cleaners door to door. He sold some magazines or other things door to door. And he worked his ass off. He was a big worker. My father was a nonstop worker. I have some of those characteristics. Morty did not. And then he got a job to clean up in a store, Maharam's, which made decorative textiles in Manhattan. I'll get to my mother afterwards. And he worked very, very hard. And then he wanted to be a salesman, and he had to learn English, proper English. He didn't learn English until he was 12, 13, 14 years old and out in the world. He lived in the land of Yiddish. And after working at Maharam's for a while, they made him a salesman. And at the age of 19 or 20, he met my mother. And she came out of an equally traumatic background. And they both spoke Yiddish together. And he then became a salesman. And he had a car. And he drove all over America. Roads were very bad in those days. We're talking of the early 20s. And he was selling fabrics. Any retail store would have a glass window with products. And he would sell textiles where you could decorate the front of the store. That was the kind of fabric that he sold. Going to my mother for a moment, my mother had an equally traumatic background. Her mother had emigrated, I think, from Poland, but I'm not sure. Her first language, she spoke, I think, Polish and German and Russian and Yiddish. Her main language was Yiddish. And she grew up speaking Yiddish to her mother. She was at the age of 19 or so, or 18, she
What about your
was,
father?
no, my mother now.
I know,
My
but what
mother-
about father?
Pardon?
What about your mother's father?
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
And according to my mother, she was raped by the man who had this mansion. He was a very successful Jewish man, powerful, successful Jewish man. And according to her, which my mother found out only when her mother was dying. She never knew this story until she was in her 20s when her mother was dying of cancer. She said, "Bertie, I have to tell you the truth. Your father was not your father. He was the father of your 4 siblings, but not of you. That I worked as a cleaning woman in this expensive house, and I was raped, and I had to get married before you were born. and therefore I married Grandpa. I would never have married Grandpa if I didn't have to have a husband.
I thought that it was an affair before marriage. I didn't know it was rape.
That's that's the story. I believe it, by the way.
Wow.
It wasn't an affair. Maybe it was an affair, but
You know
the
his
way,
origin?
what's that?
Do we know who this guy was, where he was
He
from?
was a well-to-do Jewish man, obviously of high intelligence, because my mother was extraordinarily bright and talented, and her four siblings were, you should forgive the expression, schleps. I'm sorry to be a little brutal, but I'm going to tell it to you the way I'm comfortable telling it, not try and clean it up. I think that's better, isn't it?
But yes, but I don't know if it's evidence that her father was smart because she was. Someone can be smart even if their parents weren't. You have no idea.
He had a well-to-do house. He had servants.
Okay.
The family that my grandmother, she had a candy store, and he worked for the ferry that went in Lower Manhattan to Staten Island. He was in charge of some sort of bookkeeper work for the fares for the ferry. That's what he did his whole life. I met him many times. I slept in their house many times, and he always sat in a big chair with a radio. The radio that he had, by the way, sat on the floor. It was about 3 or 4 feet high, and he would look out the window and he would listen to the radio. And on a number of occasions, I had to stay in that apartment for 4 or 5 nights when my parents were traveling. I hated it. I never had a single conversation with him. The two of them spoke together in Yiddish always. He was a non-entity, a quiet, good man who my grandmother, as the story goes, I can't verify the truth of it, had to grab someone to marry. So she grabbed him, and he didn't know what was happening to him, as it's recounted to me. And all of a sudden, he was married to this woman who was having a baby in 3, 4 months.
It sounds like she was a smart woman.
Yes, she was a very smart woman, very strong woman. She scared the shit out of me. She was very overweight, and she hit. My mother would say that in your face, smacked right in the face. My mother said she got smacked and beaten every single day of her life. And when at a later date, when I started psychotherapy and told her she had been a horrible mother to me, she said I didn't know what I was talking about, because no matter how bad she could possibly be, it wasn't a hair's breadth as bad as what she experienced. And in thinking about it, she was accurate.
I'm
So
glad you think that
this
completely.
is not a happy history. That's why I have to start all the way back.
No, but you have to understand that here I am, your granddaughter, and thank God I can say I live a happy life. So you may not have had a happy history, but you should know that you contributed to the future having a much better one.
Oh, my brother and I had an easy time of it in many ways compared to my parents. My parents were devoted to being, they felt, good parents, but they had no experience at good parenting. They didn't know what good parenting was. The best parenting they ever got in their lives when they were left alone. To
Yeah.
be in present, my father with his father, grandpa, after my father's mother died, he remarried a woman with an IQ maybe of 80 or 90, who never opened up her mouth, and he could boss around all he wanted. He got a servant. He married a servant. I remember her quite well and liked her a lot because she was kind, nonverbal. I never had a conversation with her, but there was a kindness to her face. And she liked to make pickles in the backyard. They had the first floor of a brownstone. In those days, a brownstone was a shack, by the way. It's not what you think of when you say brownstone now. It was the lowest of the low housing. And in the front of the store, he sold men's clothing. And in the back, there was a wild little yard. And she made dill pickles. And when I would come, she would grab me and smile at me. And I loved that. And she and I would go in the backyard and we would have garlic dill pickles. It was one of the sweetest memories I have of my childhood. And this is a woman I did not have
How old were you?
starting at the age of, I don't know, starting right at the beginning. The first time I met her probably was when I was 2 or 3 years old.
Hmm.
And she was kind and treated me nicely. She didn't speak English, I don't think. She only spoke Yiddish.
What was her name?
I don't know.
Hmm.
She really wasn't a person. She was, God knows where she was. He treated her like dirt. He would have a Passover dinner every year, and she was not allowed to sit with us. She just served us. She was a servant who he married. He could get her cheap.
That's horrible.
He was horrible.
You've said that.
My grandfather, my father's father, was a horrible, low-class thief of a man, a crook.
And he was also your grandfather.
He was my grandfather. Absolutely, he was my father's father. That makes him my oops, I'm sorry. I'm seeing how it works. I see a picture of myself that probably is what you see. I'm shocked at how old I look.
You don't look so old.
I don't,
You could fix that. I just don't know if I can.
no,
If
no,
you,
no, 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 I'm fine.
you don't have to see yourself if you don't want to.
No, I can tolerate it. It's a bit of a shock. There's the ditty, my face, I don't mind it. I'm behind it. It's the people out front that get the shock.
When did Abe create the business that you ended up taking over? When did he go from
I
being a
never took over his business.
I thought you took over his business.
I went to work for him, but I never took over the business. So a couple of interesting things. I could talk to you for many hours. I've thought of writing this, but it's more work than I want to do. It's an interesting story. My father and mother, when they got married, the first thing they got was a dictaphone machine that was huge. It worked with a thin wire. And it was for Yiddish speaking people who wanted to learn proper English. And they worked for hours and hours and hours practicing English so they could talk without a Yiddish accent. Because Yiddish was their first language. When Morty and I were born, Morty was the first child. Starting with Morty's birth, they agreed they would never speak a word of Yiddish ever again. They wanted to be Americans. And Americans were what they saw in movies, Hollywood. They saw these people dressed in beautiful clothes and dancing and having dinner at the Riviera. The movies of the 20s were all for immigrants who dreamed of the idyllic world of the Protestant Americans who they could see on the streets. They had elegant carriages and elegant horses, things like that. To you, it's history, and to them, it was their lives.
Where did they live when they got married?
Brooklyn initially, and then they moved to the Upper West Side, 160th Street near City College. My mother's mother, my grandmother,
Mhm.
lived up there. She had 4 siblings. The
Can you name,
fourth, what's that?
can you name them?
Sure, Judy and Evelyn, with the daughters, Saul, and Judy, Evelyn, and Sylvia and Saul. Um, 3 of the 4 of them were dummies. They probably had IQs very affected by their father, who was basically an IQ of probably 100, if that. My mother's mother had a high IQ. She was a force to be reckoned with. She was a dynamo, but she was cruel and she was furious at what had happened to her. She had dreams of making a life for herself in America. And when she got pregnant, everything was over. She had to marry far beneath her in her eyes, even though the man had a sweetness that she did not have. And
Yeah.
that sweetness helped my mother and helped everyone else. But I would say I slept in that apartment, I don't know, a half a dozen times for 3, 4, 5 days when they would go away. And I could honestly say I never spoke to him. He never talked.
Was in Staten Island or the Upper West Side?
No, my grandfather, my grandmother lived on the Upper West Side,
Okay.
up in the same area that they all wound up in. On my father's side, they were in Central.
Once your parents had you and Morty, when did they
in-
move to Great Neck?
Oh, Great Neck is.
Much later?
Are you kidding?
I don't know. I'm hearing this for the first time.
Initially, we moved into a very poor neighborhood in Queens. That's the first home I can remember. I was probably 3 years old when we moved into it. It was a house that was combined with another house, 2 houses as one, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, in a predominantly Black neighborhood, which scared the living shit out of us because the Blacks knew we were Jews and they would attack us. My father wanted us to have a Jewish education. They made us go to a shul, and Morty and I would get beaten up by the Black girls, by the way. That was particularly humiliating. It would be all right if we were both beaten up by Black boys, but we were being beat up by Black girls.
What was the shul called?
What's that?
What was the shul called where you went to get classes?
No, I have no idea.
Okay.
No memory. I hated it. I hated the whole thing. And for us to get away from home meant we were in real danger. A woman next door to me, Mrs. Homeyer, it was all Christian. There were no Jews in that area. My parents were desperate to get away from Yiddishkeit.
But yet they still sent you to classes at the shul.
They wanted to be Jews, but they wanted to get away from the poor immigrant Jews. If I had stayed in Brooklyn,
Economic side of it, not from the cultural side of it.
there was no culture. You have to remember that in these shtetls in Russia,
But there are traditions and
what's that?
but there are traditions, and traditions definitely contribute to the culture, correct?
Yes.
Like candles on Friday night and knowing how to read Hebrew to some extent, having some sort of theological backing, that contributes to parts of the culture.
No, neither one of them, to my knowledge, could read Hebrew. They could
They can read Yiddish.
Yiddish. Yiddish is like
Same same
Yiddish is a bastardized version of German. In Germany, a Yiddish-speaking person can be understood. My father could understand and be understood speaking Yiddish in Germany. remember the Jews were in Germany and then they fled and they went east to Poland and Russia. Initially, they were in Germany.
Yes.
And Yiddish was created in that area. So Yiddish and German are first cousins.
Yes.
Uh,
There is Hebrew in there.
no, Hebrew is a totally different language. Neither of them learned Hebrew. Hebrew has its origins totally different.
Okay.
Neither one of them could read or speak Hebrew.
Okay.
This is what Jews were like in Eastern Europe.
So I still don't understand why they sent you to Jewish classes at the shul if they wanted nothing to do.
They wanted me to have some Jewish culture.
So what do you mean by that? What does that mean to you as a child? Jewish culture.
Meant nothing.
What did it mean in your mind? Even though emotionally, yes, it meant nothing.
Predominantly what it meant to me, right or wrong, was that Jews were superior to the people that were all around us. I would say 60% of the people around us were Black, and all the rest were a Christian in one way or another, Catholic, Protestant. My big friend was next door, Mrs. Homeyer, who commercially raised chickens. She had a couple of hundred chickens. So from the age of about 5, I started working with chickens. I would hold them while she would chop their heads off. And that was my big connection was Mrs. Homeyer. My mother did not want to be a mother. She had been brutalized growing up. My mother was infinitely better a mother. I'm sorry, what?
Do you mind pushing the screen back down?
Oh,
Perfect.
I'm sorry. That's
okay.
better?
Yeah, so much better. Your mother didn't want to be a mother because she was brutalized.
That's right.
But
She had never experienced mothering. Her mother was not a mother.
how was she to you?
My mother, distant, beautiful, talented. I was in love with her, but I had no contact with her really. She would not talk to me. I tried being sick a great deal. And then I was sent away when I was 9, 10 years old because I was always sick. And then I lost her altogether. And then I never forgave her for sending me away for 8, 9 months.
Where did she send you?
I went to a boarding school in Florida,
Do you remember what it was called?
Normandy Private School.
Can you tell me
I
about
took,
your experiences
this
there?
was in 19, this was when the war was still on in 1945, it was just ending. And I was on a DC-3, it's a 2-engine plane. We made 4 or 5 stops to Florida. My parents thought they were sending me to a paradise where I would be 2 blocks from the water. I could go swimming in the wintertime. They would give me meals. I would be in a dormitory with 20 other kids. They thought it would be wonderful. And I was always sick. So of course I was
real sick.
probably I was predominantly sick in order to get my mother's attention.
Yeah.
I would say predominantly in looking back on it. And she, and they were very poor, you have to understand, and they were always trying to live beyond their means. And she frequently would leave me alone with the radio, and I would listen to the radio by myself. She was a terrible mother.
What about to Morty?
Morty is another story. I'll get to him.
Was she a different mother to him than she was to
Yeah,
you?
no, she was the same with both.
Okay.
She had no favorites. The problem with me is Morty was an ugly child. He got good looking when he was older, whereas I was a gorgeous child. I say that in a way you smile, but it was the curse of my life because the following one, oh, he's so gorgeous, he should be a girl. And my mother desperately wanted a girl who she could dress and she could uh,
Doda.
do the nails, do the hair, and have a life that she dreamed that she might have and didn't, because she hated her mother hated her, and yet she was a brilliant, a talented, extraordinarily talented woman. I will tell you just one little story. At one point, this is in public school, and she was younger than 13. A woman called, I guess, or came, I don't know, was related to me, and wanted to know what kind of a piano they had at home. And my grandmother said, "We have no piano." And she said, "That's not possible." It turned out my mother found a piano in her public school, taught herself how to play, and gave recitals.
Good ones. Yeah.
And she found an accordion and started playing the accordion. She loved the accordion because she could play old country music.
Native
Accordion,
American.
I think, something special. My mother had a very high IQ and was brilliant and talented beyond words. Her life was filled with amazing accomplishment, as my father was also. As a start, as soon as she left home, she made all her own clothes. She would get the fashion magazines. She couldn't afford to buy the clothes, but she made them. The big expense was that she had a mannequin made of her body, which you could get in those days, because a lot of women made their own clothes in those days. Clothes were expensive, and there wasn't much of a selection. And so she had a mannequin made of her body so she could make the clothes on the mannequin, which is what she did. And so she was always well dressed in clothes that she made. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And she decided she was going to be a concert pianist. I'm going to let Renee take that call. Who is it? That's
Call from wireless.
Wireless means someone selling an advertisement. These are amazing stories, amazing stories.
How was your parents' relationship like when
With
you
who?
were growing up? With each other?
With my brother?
No, with each other. Their marriage.
On and off. They broke up when I was about 4 years old, 5 years old. I was in kindergarten, and she had a friend, Harriet. Is that Harriet or another name like that? In any event, the other woman was breaking up with her marriage, and she had 2 children. And at my father's expense, I might add, because he wasn't breaking up, she was breaking up from him, because he was something of a brute. He was a narcissist and full of his own success. He had come out of shit and he was making a real life for himself. And he was very handsome, he was very tall, and he was into clothes, beautiful clothes. And they were living in almost a slum neighborhood. My first home that I remember is almost a slum neighborhood. Mrs. Homeyer next door lived on her chickens. I would cut the heads off the chickens for Mrs. Homeyer. Her son would bring back dead deer, which they would hang in the garage and butcher and freeze. And I would grow vegetables, because this was World War II. And I would hear the people next door, because there's a split home, and 4 people with 1 bathroom is an interesting situation. I had remarkable parents, far more remarkable than Eda Morty.
What made them
Eda
get back?
Morty and I. What?
What made them get back together? You said they split up when you were 4.
So they split up, but my father God love him, didn't want to split up. And he said, why don't you go to Florida? So she went down to Florida with Marty and I and put us in school. I was in kindergarten and Marty was maybe in second grade. And that was Normandy School, where I first discovered Normandy School. And we were there for 6 months. And my mother, I think, dated other men, which was very traumatic for me. I got enraged when I met one of the men.
Do
So
you
I obviously understood something was going on, but though I didn't really understand it. This was like 4 or 5 years old. And then I guess they got back together. I have memories of we went down there by train. It took 2 or 3 days to get to Miami by train. And then we took a train back. I have memories of being in the train.
When did your father go from being a simple salesman to making a success of himself?
He started off as a cleaning man.
Yeah, and then he became the
Then he
sales.
became a salesman and traveling salesman all over. So he worked at Maharam's, I guess in his mid-20s. He quit Maharam's and went into business for himself. And after a year and a half competing with Maharam's, he went bankrupt. And Maharam's took him back because he was the best salesman they ever had. They hated him and needed him. He quit a second time and went into business a second time, went bankrupt. He had no working capital, so that's why he went bankrupt. And Maharam's took him back a second time, even though they know eventually if he saved enough money, he was going to leave a third time, which he eventually did. And this time he made it, selling theatrical fabrics that stores used to decorate their windows, and boxes.
What did he call his, did he make a company of some sort, or was it just his name?
It was a small company. I think it was probably called Kaplan Products. That's my guess. I don't know that as a fact. He made a relationship with a man in Oneida, New York. Oneida, New York was very famous. It was the only place in America making their own silverware. Oneida silver was very famous. And my father started selling them velveteen to line the boxes that silver went in. And to make it in the business world, I'm going to tell you something a little shocking. You have to bribe people. There is no such thing as a rich, honest man.
Okay, we'll agree to disagree there, but okay.
Let me tell you again.
Okay.
Unless you inherit it, there is no such thing as a rich, honest man in America, unless you are brilliant enough to come up with a patent, or an invention, that sort of thing. But if you are essentially selling a product, there is no such thing as a rich man who's honest. That includes me, by the way.
Okay. Got it.
Okay, I won't dramatize it anymore. I don't know if this is shocking for you, but I assume it's interesting since it's the truth.
You can't shock me at this point.
Yeah, I bet you I
I've
could.
heard too many. I've heard too.
My father, at no time in his marriage, wanted anything else but to be married to my mother. He idealized her. He idealized her and adored her. And that was my tendency also, by the way, when I married Simone and then Renee. That's my tendency. And then when they fail me, I rage. First, I put them up too high. And then when they fail me, I want to cut their legs off. So I've worked at becoming more civilized and not idealizing so much and not getting so angry when they fail me. So that's part of my story too. Morty never played a game with me in any manner, shape, or form. He wanted nothing to do with me.
Tell
If
me
it,
something positive about Morty first.
do you want me to tell you something?
Before you get to all his faults, tell me something positive about Morty.
He was extraordinarily intelligent and competent. Everything he did beautifully. He was incredibly talented. He could do backflips. He could do acrobatics. He could draw. He had he had a terrific vocabulary. I could not talk until I got to high school. I had
For me,
I couldn't talk. I had speech therapy constantly, and I could not talk. So I was largely silent, or I talked in a corrupted way. I was a very damaged kid.
but look at you now.
And I wanted to be a girl. And that's not a good thing for a boy.
Because your mother wanted you to be a girl.
Absolutely. If I was a girl, I would have been in heaven because I was gorgeous enough to be a girl. And everyone said, "Oi, he should be a girl." And all I wanted was to be a girl. And I had thoughts of cutting off my penis and being a girl.
Okay, no one wants to hear that.
You may not want to hear it, but it's the story of my life. You want the story of my life, or you want a novel?
I want the story of your life. But I also, Grandpa, I also don't believe that it was all. I know you think your history is terrible and horrible and no good, very bad, but I also believe that there has to have been positive and joyful moments, and I'd love to hear more about the joyful moments of your childhood, about the positive moments and the positive memories.
I have no positive memories really until I was like 13, 14 years old. I was a terribly anxious and I became a very, very private person. The happiest part of my life was nature. We lived next to a very large cemetery, and the
Which
fences.
cemetery?
What's that?
Which cemetery?
I have no idea. Or somewhere's in Queens. And I would go into the cemetery almost every day, and it was the only nature that was available. And they had these stone houses where people were buried, and I would sit there, and there were birds, and there was trees, and I fell in love with the cemetery. It was the best thing around, and I was always by myself. Morty hated me and tortured me. He certainly didn't want a brother. On the other hand, I clung to him because my mother was not available, my father was not available, so all I had was Morty. And I clung to Morty, which kept me from developing my own wherewithal. And Morty hated me. Here, I'll give you a little fact. I do not remember, and I think it's accurate, a single time in any manner, shape, or form that the two of us played a game together. No cards, no Monopoly, no games, no nothing. He wanted nothing to do with me. I was the gorgeous young boy who should have been a girl. And he was brilliant. He was verbal, articulate, strong. I was very, very skinny. And he was the jewel of the family. And isn't it odd that when it came to going out in the world, I was always a success and he was always a failure? It goes to show you something.
Tell me about your time in Florida at the boarding school. You were there for 8 months, you said? 6 months, 8 months?
About 7, 8 months. Uh, and during that period of time, I decided I would never have anything to do with my mother again. My father came down once. He had a business meeting with someone, and he took me fishing. But I fell in love with nature.
In
Uh,
Florida.
I hated the school. There was a woman who ran the school by the name of Kaplan, Mrs. Kaplan. And when I first came, I started helping her by setting all the table. There was about, I don't know, there were about 10 boys and 10 girls in the school that lived there full time. And then there was an equal amount that came for the day. And I helped prepare the meals, setting the tables. For the first 2 or 3 weeks, she thought I had a jewel, and she adored me. And I was out to win her over. And then she discovered I wasn't brushing my teeth. And she said I had to brush my teeth. And I said, I won't brush my teeth. And I never brushed my teeth, by the way, until I probably graduated high school. I have very good teeth, incidentally. And she turned on me, and I never spoke to her again. You see, I gave up on my mother and never spoke to her. And then I gave up on Mrs. Kaplan. And I didn't make friends in the school. Instead, they gave me free time. And I was 2 blocks from Biscayne Bay. And I took up fishing and walking. This was during World War II, by the way. And I was very tragic, full of daydreams. But I got friendly with some of the odd characters on Biscayne Bay. One man who had a little motorboat, and he had a monkey. And I would go to him, and he talked to me. And I did a lot of fishing with a drop line. I had a drop line. I dreamed of a rod and reel, but a drop line was all I had. And my father sent me money where I could buy shrimp, and the shrimp was the bait. And
Do you remember your first catch?
what's that?
Do you remember your first catch?
Oh, I caught fish all the time. The Biscayne Bay was full of fish.
What was the
And,
best fish you caught? The largest fish?
I think I caught a barracuda once, but I'm not sure. It got away before I brought it up.
That's scary to catch.
And I don't know if it was a man or woman, I don't even have a memory, but I would bring the fish and they would serve it. They would clean it and serve it. I didn't clean the fish, they cleaned the fish. And that was the best part of it, was the nature. I loved the nature, and here I am living by the water.
Yeah.
No accident, because I felt I didn't have a mother, I didn't have a father, I didn't have a brother, but I had Mother Nature. And Mother Nature saved my life between the cemetery and then what I experienced in Florida. I've had many psychoanalyses, 5 of them, with 5 different therapists. So I know my childhood, I know my background. What I'm telling you is pretty accurate. It may sound exaggerated or caricature, but it isn't. Morty was more damaged than I was. My
Wow.
parents neither experienced any parenting whatsoever. My mother was constantly being beaten for having destroyed her mother's life. And my father lost his mother when he was 5, 6 years old and had a brutal father. And the 2 of them were determined to be good parents, which meant nice clothing, all the food we needed, education. And if we got sick, we had a doctor. And they didn't understand what nurture was. They had never experienced it. Both of them had to invent themselves. I can't emphasize that enough, that they were good people, but they were inventions of themselves. And that's rather unusual and extraordinary. If I was to write a book, I would write it about the nature of having to invent a personhood for yourself rather than take it from your mother and father.
I think more people do that to some extent than you think. I do.
Maybe. You may be right.
Yeah,
You may be right. Is it true of you?
I hope so.
Mhm. Well,
think
it's not.
Parents have done a
It's,
wonderful job, but I also hope that
Mhm.
there's free will involved there.
There is free will.
Yeah.
I believe in free will.
All right. I want to stop here.
Mhm.
And then when we come back, let's pick up from about when you were, let's say, 12 years old, and we'll go from there. So we'll move into your teenage years. But what I really want to hear about is your history from going into business and then deciding to leave the business and go into psychotherapy, and start your own and go back to school
Mhm.
later in your career.
Psychotherapy was my fourth career. I had
I
three
know.
before then.
We'll get into it, but I want to stop here and then we'll pick up at the age of 12. Your age
Okay.
of 12.
I think you're very good at this, by the way.
I
You
think
might
so too.
you might pursue it as a profession.
I
Uh,
think not, but I enjoy it. I don't want to ruin it by pursuing it as a profession.
well, I think one could enjoy it if if you don't have to sell your soul in order to be it. Uh, it's a good profession. Not everyone is a good listener and a questioner, and that takes real talent. For instance, I would be terrible at it because I can't keep my mouth shut. I want to do the talking, like
Very
my
different
father.
when you were a child.
Oh, as child, as silent.
I know.
Yes. And when I talked, it was baby talk. When I said magazine, I said mazagine. When I said antiques, I said antique. I couldn't talk. I had speech therapy right through high school. And then when I learned to talk, you can't stop me.
Okay. Well, we'll pick up with your talking at age 12. Hopefully sometime soon. We'll figure out a date.
You're inviting me to do something I enjoy very much, which is talking about myself.
I'm happy. I'm gonna
Bye
stop.
bye.